Hi everyone, it's Dana Price and welcome to App Transformers, More That Meets the Eye. Today our session is called You Thought You Knew About zOS App Modernization and You Want the Truth. And I'm very excited today to be joined by Rosalind. And Rosalind, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about you?
Sure, I'm happy to be here. Rosalind Radcliffe, IBM Distinguished Engineer, responsible for DevOps for enterprise systems. I deal with everything enterprise-focused, IBM Z, and large enterprise systems of record, working with clients in their end-to-end organization, doing transformations, as well as responsible for our development tooling when it comes to IBM Z.
Nice. And I am a specialist in app modernization, the architect in the app platform area. So we do all kinds of things with app modernization. It's really a thrill to have Rosalind here today. So I'll show you our homepage, and I hope you join us for other sessions as well. If you haven't had a chance, we are on, it looks like it is our 13th session of App Transformers. We've talked about the tools related to Java workload modernization. We have Transformation Advisor, Mono to Micro, WebSphere Application Migration Toolkit. We've talked about some of the organizational things related to breaking down your monoliths into microservices, how you have to address your organization during your app modernization. And so today we'll be focusing on how we look at zOS and our zOS workloads when we're talking about app modernization. So please join us in the chat. If you have any questions, I'll be watching the chat and try to integrate any questions and comments there. And I hope you join us and view some of our previous sessions if they're of interest to you. So Rosalind, a lot of our discussions around app modernization are around Java workloads and moving them from our on-premise environment into cloud optimized runtimes in the cloud. And a lot of times the words zOS modernization, folks think that means moving off of Z in order to modernize, but really that's not the case at all. So could you tell us a little bit about zOS modernization and what that means to you?
Yeah, it is really important, and then what I consider application modernization. When we think of application modernization, we'd consider, I mean, you bring a good point, taking and trying to move to the cloud. Why am I trying to move them to the cloud? I want agility, I want ease of deployment, I want the ability to go and get large. Anyways, IBM was the cloud, so it gives me all of those characteristics.
Hold on a second. Hold on, Rosalind. For some reason, we were just fine, and your microphone seems to have a strange background noise. It's kind of like robotic. Let's see if we can, yeah, that might help. Let's see.
Let's see on a second.
Yeah, let's change mics, and then we'll start from where you were talking about your, when you introduced yourself, it sounded just great, and I could hear everything. Something else changed in the stream.
How about that? Does that sound better again?
Yep, it does. Awesome. Okay. Thank you. Love live shows. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, that always happens. So here we go again. Application modernization. When you talk about application modernization, you just mentioned this idea of going to the cloud and moving to the cloud. But when we think about IBM Z, in many ways, it already has the characteristics of a cloud. It already provides that scalability. It already provides a lot of things that you want to move to the cloud for. And so when we think about app modernization of our existing zOS applications, we need to look at them and understand what belongs on that platform. So on box modernization, what's the right thing to do on box? Or what's the right thing to maybe refactor and change because maybe it doesn't need to be in COBOL. Maybe it should be in Java, or maybe it should be running in Liberty, or maybe it should be bursted to the cloud somewhere because I want it next to the user. So that we've got to look at these applications. They've been built over the last 30 years, 40 years, longer. And one of the best things about zOS is something you wrote 30-something years ago and compiled 30-something years ago still runs on IBM Z, latest hardware, latest machines. And one of the worst things about zOS is something you wrote 30 years ago that you compiled 30 years ago still runs. Yeah. So we have a lot of old applications that haven't even been recompiled. So they aren't taking advantage of the latest machine. And some of that is really valuable for the organization, but it could be better. And we also have processes and practices that have developed over the last 30, 40 years that also have not changed in the last 30, 40 years. And so the way we do development needs to change. And so on Box, we can do all that and look at what should be there and maybe what should go somewhere else or what needs to be somewhere else.
Yeah, you bring up a good point of there's value in something that doesn't change. I mean, that's the whole idea of containerized images, is that you can move it. You can have the entire environment around it modified, upgraded, enhanced, and your workload still can be deployed and run. And so that's all goodness, as long as your workload is something that you didn't want to change. And I know that one of the things that comes into play in modernization is we make choices about this workload, should I retire it, rewrite it, modernize it to a more modern runtime. You mentioned something that was very interesting. And I know, having had a history in WebSphere, that we have had enhancements in the JDK that will allow an application without being changed to run more efficiently. And I know that that happens with the runtimes around us as well. But you mentioned that there are things that you can do with that same application now with your tooling that will make that same application without having to necessarily be rewritten or change owners. And I know that's a scary thing, is when you inherit code. I love the idea of heritage applications. It kind of makes me think of, your family has created this wealth of value, and you have to pick out the things that are truly those gold coins and valuable things versus the aluminum foil pie tins. You have to weigh them and decide what's going to continue going and providing that value. So what are the tools that you are talking about when you say you have COBOL applications and you're going to be able to have them still be what they are and be enhanced through your tools? What kind of tools are you talking about?
Well, there are a couple of different things we look at. ADDI, Application Discovery and Delivery Intelligence, an example of a wonderful IBM product name. ADDI helps you understand the applications so you can understand what you have. And that's the first problem. The people who wrote the application may not be around anymore. They may have retired or died. But the point is, they may not be there. And maybe they are, but they don't remember. I'm sorry, if I wrote something 30 years ago, I don't remember that code. If I haven't been in it recently. And so ADDI helps you understand the applications. It helps you understand how they're set up so that you can do things like expose those services using things like zOS Connect. I can put a REST interface in front of this COBOL application. I can now use it anywhere in my enterprise. But I had to understand where that was. And sometimes business logic and screen logic and such are all mixed together. And so I need to do that refactoring. I use tools like IBM Developer for Z to do that understanding. And we have the latest capability in Wazi Analyze that's part of ADDI that lets a developer look at their branch of code. They can look at their application. They can do a really quick scan and get that understanding and that dependencies. They can get a better understanding to improve their code. This combination of things helps you understand your code. And then using modern development practices, modern DevOps pipelines. I mentioned a few tools that are very specific to zOS development.
Right.
But when we think about the development process, you're using Git somewhere. It's GitHub, GitLab, something. You're
Right.
using Jenkins or GitLab CI or Azure DevOps. Those work for COBOL too. And then if you think about it, I have a modern IDE. I have a tool that tells me how the application fits together and works. And I use the modern development tools that everyone else is used to, and anyone can do development in COBOL. They can improve the applications. They can make those parts better. They can pull out sections like UI that please shouldn't be a 3270 in front of our users anymore. So we can do these things.
So JR and I, in our session about a month ago, talked about when you are refactoring an application and breaking it into independent pieces. We like to say the word microservice, but not everything has to be a microservice when you break it into pieces. Our 3-tier applications make a lot of sense when we're re-architecting to peel off an aspect of it and deliver it independently, because our teams are different, the team skills are different, and that seems to be an aspect that ADDI will help us then in decision making to partition that, and then use our tools, which you mentioned, of being able to expose the REST APIs for the part that's going to stay how it was. So there's some parallels between the way that we think about it with Java. It's exactly the same. You have some languages that are more appropriate for certain aspects of an application. UI is one of those we did have to program for in Z when that was all we had. So that's interesting. And those tools are built in. How do our clients get a hold of those tools?
So from a pipeline standpoint, you use what you have. Literally, take your distributed pipeline, what you're doing for your cloud native development, and you use it. And then you plug in the things. You need ADDI, which is a product we provide. So you can get ADDI and bring it into your environment. We have IDZ, or IBM Developer for Z, and it provides Eclipse-based tooling, so I run it alongside all the rest of my Eclipse tools. If I'm using Eclipse for Java development, same thing. Or it provides capability in VS Code. So if I want to do VS Code for my IDE, I can do my COBOL PL1 assembler in VS Code, and I can get that as part of the IBM Developer for Z experience. So I've got all of that. And then build. Here's where we get into the weird thing. Java, you have Maven, you have Gradle, you have Ant, depends on what you do. COBOL needs a build tool. So we have IBM dependency-based build, which is Groovy-based, looks remarkably kind of like Gradle. We may be working on Gradle for the future, but it gives you this modern build capability. Works really well. Now I can, build my Z units in this environment. I can do all those same kind of things, but I'm bringing the process, practices, and tools from everywhere else into the zOS world.
So you get a unified process that everyone is able to hook into, and therefore the enhancements to the process apply to everyone as well, and the monitoring of it. Nice. So I know you and I had a conversation earlier. I had one today. We have Z, we have zOS, we have what I know I shouldn't say, Z Linux. We have Linux on Z. We have Linux One. There's all kinds of things that whenever we talk about Z and zOS, help me understand, what do all these names mean, and what is what, and what's right to use, and when we're having these conversations, what is all that? Help us figure that part out.
IBM Z is a brand, but IBM Z is also the hardware. IBM Z15, latest generation of hardware, most modern machine out there. And I never remember all the fun facts, but it scales more than anything else and provides security and pervasive encryption and all the fun things. IBM Z. On IBM Z, the hardware, Z15, I can run a number of different operating systems. I can run zOS, which we've been talking about. I can run TPF, Transaction Processing Facility, which the airlines and retail use to get that really fast transaction performance. I can run VSE, but we'll ignore that one. And I can run Linux. So I can run Linux on Z, which is why we call it Linux on Z instead of Z-Linux, because it's still Linux. It's just Linux. It just runs on S390 architecture. And then Z is a machine that many of our clients know and love. And lots of the Fortune 500, the largest banks in the world, largest insurance, they run Z. And then there's the rest of the world that doesn't do Z. And when they hear Z, they maybe think mainframe, and they don't like that word. So we have Linux One, which is the same architecture, S390 architecture, but it is optimized so it runs Linux and Linux only. So I can get a Linux One machine if what I want to do is run a whole bunch of Linux or OpenShift on Z, whatever, that kind of environment. It's a, as I call it, a baby cloud. It's its own cloud. You can spin up, spin down lots of Linux images, and you don't have the Z name associated with it. It is under the covers.
The same architecture.
The same architecture, the same machine-ish. I mean, it doesn't do the zOS parts and all the other operating systems. It does Linux. It's built specifically for Linux to make it easy as a client who needs to scale up their Linux. They want to scale lots of things co-located with something else. We have clients who have Z and Linux One sitting side by side. Z has the data, Linux One sitting there connected. Now I get optimized access. There are lots of things that can be done to make that even better.
Cool. Well, it helps that I get myself wrapped around all the acronyms and what goes where. So thank you very much for that piece. In terms of modernization, so when we're talking about our applications and the decision making around it, before you get to the point of applying ADDI to it, and breaking an application apart, what are other considerations that I have when I look to modernize, and what are the particular gains? I know my experience 30 some years ago, I actually was working on System 360 with punched cards. So there's a long history of efficiency and workloads. And a lot of the cloud concepts are things that were in Z or System 360, 370, 390 over time. And now are available at a much larger scale and usage pattern. What are the other considerations I have with modernization when I'm looking at zOS app modernization?
Well, you really need to look at what you have. What are the things you're doing? Are those things optimized for high security requirements? Do I care a lot about security? Do I care a lot about encryption? Do I care a lot about that kind of access? Do I care about high throughput? Do I care about transactional reliability? Do I care about the ability to have a system always on? So I get into this discussion of error budgets with SRE and, what's the percentage of downtime? Well, when you have a zero error budget, I mean, there is no downtime allowed. That's when you use a Z, because it's zero downtime. That's what it means. That's what it stands for. You don't want VisaNet and scanning your credit cards to ever be down. There is no downtime. If I want zero downtime, I look at it from that perspective. So there's a set of things. And one of the things that's important to look at is data and the transactions. And what is the relationship of that? Am I changing the data very frequently? Do I need that fast I/O that zOS has been optimized for? The Z hardware is extremely well suited for fast I/O changes. So those kinds of things fit really well in the platform. If I'm trying to bring a bunch of social media together, social media data, and I'm trying to bring it with a bunch of different cloud sources and a bunch of different things, so the data is all over the world, and maybe that's not optimized for running. By the way, it could anyway, and I might run it on a Linux to be able to scale it up high, a Linux one to scale it up higher. But that's the kind of thing I look at my application for. What does it do? Why is it doing that? And what does it need to do? And the other thing about zOS is, I know in the cloud, you build applications for reliability because the system is unreliable. In the cloud, you assume it can fail anytime. You have to build your code that way. zOS, the operating system and the environment with a sysplex function, sysplex, for those of you who don't know sysplex, it's kind of like clustering except on steroids maybe. A sysplex environment, I don't have to do that. The Kix environment, the IM, those environments have been designed at the core to help you with this availability problem. And so you're writing less code because the system's doing that guaranteed reliability part of it for you. I can literally change out the entire operating system and not have anything go down because I've just rotated the work somewhere else in the system. It gives me that, and it gives me fast I/O. In the cloud, I have eventual consistency.
Right.
Well, my bank account balance can't be eventually consistent. Right. My bank account balance has to be always consistent. And so that's a reason why you may consider zOS. That's a reason why a lot of people consider zOS. So you're looking at the application and figuring out what fits and what can move. And with the fact that we can run zOS or Linux in the machine, I can have zOS applications, COBOL applications, Java running on zOS close to the data. I can also run my containers, my Linux containers in that same system close to the data, if that's the right thing, or run them wherever I need to. And that's the options. You've got the spectrum.
Yeah, Roland and I talked last episode about data and the decisions around data, around eventual consistency, and there are lots of scenarios for which that is good. And the proximity to data and transactions, of course, is one of those concepts that requires high throughput, high speed access to your data. So that's an interesting aspect. So when you're looking at app modernization, what are the other considerations that you are taking into account?
Well, the first thing I actually work with customers on is their process and practice, because actually the biggest problem in most environments with IBM Z is they've updated the machines, running the latest hardware. In many cases, they're running the latest versions of the compilers. They've done all that right. And their process is from 1980, and sorry, I'm going to say 1987, because that's actually when I started, and I know what the process was in 1987. It was probably the same before that. The process is the same. I have a developer writing some code, and they have a dev environment, and they write that code. And then someone else, they have to wait until the person's ready, and then it moves into QA, and it's based on a schedule that's a 12-month schedule or a whatever month schedule. And I have weeks and weeks of system test, which actually finds the unit test bugs that I should have found back here because there was no automated testing, and I go back to the beginning. So it's the process that's the first thing, and that's true for everything. I'm sorry, I've seen some monolithic Java applications not running on Z that had the same problem.
That's right.
Process, culture, ways of working is the first thing. The second thing is, am I running things that I maybe shouldn't be running? I use an example, and it should work, and then I tripped over a customer it didn't work for. But like, for example, you're not going to run your email system on zOS, right? Right. Well, I actually tripped over a client that was written homegrown. So yeah, but that's an example of something probably doesn't belong. So look at the applications, understand them.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is universal. That one of the ideas is, what are you looking to gain from modernization? If you want agility, you cannot have a quarterly review of when an application can be deployed. it doesn't matter where your application is living or being developed, or how great your team is, or how good the back-end connections are. If there's parts in your process that are slowing you down or causing gated access to the next phase. So I love that with zOS, the tools are allowing us then to subscribe to what we end up having as general things. Have a published API, have a good DevOps flow. And I have to call out that you have an award for a DevOps Evangelist. Tell me about that, because that's an interesting kind of award. And how did you get it?
So I started a while ago with the DevOps Enterprise Summit. I attended my first DevOps Enterprise Summit, and I showed up and sat at the right table and said something, which surprised, and I was scheduled to speak. I was one of the keynote speakers. And the reason I was brought in was to talk about DevOps and the mainframe, which just in an enterprise audience, and this was, I don't know, 7 years ago or so. I don't know how long ago. We've been doing it for a while, but it was something this audience had no clue about. And I sat down and I kind of changed some people's minds. And so my session actually got delayed by a small bit by having someone introduce me by starting out with, "This person blew my mind that the DevOps works for the mainframe." And since then, I've just been able to participate in lots of different forums and lots of different places to really bring DevOps and the mainframe together.
Closer together.
IBM Z, it can do it. There's nothing stopping you. You can spin up, spin down. And so DevOps.com does an Evangelist of the Year, and it's based on people voting. So it's entirely social media people voting. And I got voted DevOps Evangelist of the Year 2019. I was on stage everywhere and did a lot of podcasts and a lot of sessions. And I enjoy it. And I need everyone in the world to understand that there's nothing about IBM Z that says you can't just do the same DevOps practices. Awesome.
Well, we're glad you joined us today to share that message. And I didn't see any questions in the chat, but if you're watching this as a rerun or a replay, please do reach out if you have questions or comments. We look for suggestions all the time in our channel for subject matter that is of interest related to app modernization. And Rosalind, it was a real pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for sharing and evangelizing the tools that are available for those workloads that are not our normal discussion on this channel around Java workloads, and how we can have all those same concerns, those same processes applied for our zOS applications as well. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.